Hello, and once again welcome to the Cambridge Conference on Catastrophic Risk 2020. I'm Simon Beard, I'm the Academic Programme Manager here at the Centre for the Study of Existential Risk, and I wanted to say a few words about what we're trying to achieve with the Cambridge Conference on Catastrophic Risk generally, and with this conference in particular. The Cambridge Conferences on Catastrophic Risk are conceived of as being the single biggest meeting place for all the different people who work on global catastrophic risks and existential risks around the world. And as such, we invite a very wide diversity of researchers to join us here as panelists and participants. And that we find stimulates a lot of productive and useful discussions. We hope you're really going to enjoy the experience of being here and sharing this time with us. The goal of this conference in particular is to revisit the work of Martin Rees, and in particular his 2003 book, Our Final Century, which is one of the first really credible scientific works to bring together all the different kinds of global catastrophic risk and consider how they're related to one another. I've recently completed some historical research into the development of the field of global catastrophic and existential risk studies, and I'll be sharing the link to that in the text in relation to this video. From it, I really came to appreciate just how diverse the many different perspectives that people have brought to this field are, and how vital it is that we all listen to and respect the different points of view that we share. Roughly speaking, I saw that there were 5 different fields that have really fed in a lot to global catastrophic risk as it is in 2020. And I'll just briefly run through them before turning to the themes from Martin's book and how they relate to these. The first field that has contributed a lot to the field of global catastrophic risk studies is actually science fiction. This goes back really to the 19th century and to the very early days of science fiction, with authors like Mary Shelley and Lord Byron being very concerned about global catastrophes and even the potential for human extinction. One of the first works to consider human extinction from a secular point of view was Mary Shelley's 1826 novel, The Last Man, which imagines all of humanity being wiped out by a plague, leaving only one survivor. The first non-fiction book about global catastrophic risk is probably Isaac Asimov's 1977 A Choice of Catastrophes, in which he goes through all the different ways in which first the universe, then the solar system, then Earth, then humanity, and then our civilization might perish. However, it wasn't long until credible scientists joined science fiction authors in raising concerns about technological threats and the future of humanity. Early concerns about the risk of nuclear weapons were soon joined by worries about overpopulation and environmental decline, biological weapons and the development of new biotechnologies, and of course artificial intelligence. By the 1960s, all 4 of these threats were being taken very seriously by scientists around the world, although they tended to focus on one particular threat at a time. Martin's work as a scientist who was willing to bring together all of these different concerns and consider them side by side was therefore very instrumental in formulating the idea of existential risk as a unified field of concern and study. Other groups who played a pivotal role in this were transhumanists, who saw a bright future for humanity if only we could develop the right technologies and the right sorts of social organization to gain maximum benefit out of them. However, inherent in transhumanist hopes were also transhumanist fears that within these technologies, humanity was serving the seeds of its own destruction. Therefore, many transhumanists, such as Nick Bostrom and Anders Sandberg, amongst others, became early pioneers in the field of existential risk studies. In the last 10-15 years, their ranks have been greatly swelled thanks to the work of effective altruists, whose concern was how much good that they could do and what the best ways to bring about the best outcomes were. While early effective altruists were chiefly focused on concerns about development and later animal suffering, a realization that our impact on the far future is one of the biggest effects that any of us can have quickly followed. And the influx of not only money, but skills, talents, and intelligence that they brought into the field has seen a remarkable transformation and growth. The final group of scholars who I see as contributing significantly to the fields of existential and global catastrophic risk studies are those who see humanity's future and the risks facing us as lying predominantly in the systems that we create and their vulnerability to collapse. This is a field that traces its roots back to the 1970s and groups like the Club of Rome, but it's really taken off in the last 5 years or so, with an increased realization that environmental threats like climate change and loss of biodiversity are no less urgent than the technological concerns that are raised by prominent scientists and transhumanists. So I hope that you'll be able to see all 5 of these strands of research in the panelists and in your conversation with other participants. And I hope that we can all listen and learn from what each other has to bring. I certainly feel that the conference has been put together in such a way that we're going to see a lot of these different perspectives in the panels as we consider different themes that emerge out of Martin's wonderful book. In the first panel, we're going to consider some of this historical context, and in particular, which concerns about human extinction and global catastrophe were dominant before the early 2000s with the work of Martin Rees, Nick Bostrom and others. 2 key concerns that we'll be looking at are the threat of nuclear weapons and of overpopulation. But these raise important issues about global governance and power structures and how these relate to existential risk more generally. In the second panel tomorrow, we're going to look at one of the biggest and boldest claims that Martin made in his book. The notion that the chances of human civilization making it through the 21st century unscathed are no better than 50-50. How credible is a prediction like this? And what are some of the alternatives that people have made to it? Then we're going to turn to considering human extinction and global catastrophes against the backdrop of the long-term future of humanity, both in terms of the future centuries and future millennia or even longer. In the second half of the conference, we'll be turning to some of the main drivers of global catastrophic risk as we see them here at CSER. We'll start by looking at one of the important distinctions that Martin draws between risks of error and risks of terror, and ask whether there isn't actually a third driver somewhere between these two, global injustice. Acts and systems that are contributing directly to global catastrophes because they are in the interest of current elites or because they are systematically ignoring the interests of some of the worst affected groups, both in terms of environmental and technological risks. Next, we're going to look at the question of who does research, who does technological development, and what effect that can have on the risks involved and the benefits and how those are distributed. Thirdly, we're going to look at what Martin calls the background level of risks, risks to humanity that originate in our environment, both terrestrial and celestial, including volcanoes and asteroids, and whether there are significant threats in this field that are currently being overlooked. And finally, we're going to look at humans' impact on that environment and the growing threat of global catastrophic environmental risk and how existential risk scholars might think about and respond to this. I'm really excited to get started on some of these discussions, and I hope you are too. But before we start with any of the panels, I'd like to invite Martin Rees to give his own perspective on our final century, what he thinks its intervening time has taught us about global catastrophic risk, and whether there's anything that he'd like to update and change about his perspectives as presented in that book. Over to you, Martin.